It's a pleasure to talk about our research today. This was commissioned by NCSC and done in collaboration with CSET Georgetown, which many of you might know from the US. So CETAS is the policy research arm of our defense and security program over in the Turing, which is the UK's National Institute for AI and Data Science. We work really closely with government partners, including GCHQ, DSDL, the MOD. We're also the only publicly avowed research partner of MI5. And last year, 2 researchers from our defense and security program won 2 out of 3 of the CAGE challenges, beating out competition like Apple and Raytheon with quite limited resources. So DSDL is now essentially investing in scaling up their research in RL for cyber defense. And accompanying that, CETAS is doing a policy research work stream that focuses on how to overcome some of the implementation challenges and the pain points in developing RL for cyber defense. And I actually came to the Turing coming from a place called RAND, which was specializing on futures methodologies, but mainly looking at things like future combat air or protection systems on main battle tanks. And when it came to the Turing, I'm essentially in charge of applying some of those research methodologies, but using them on AI-based capabilities like autonomous cyber defense. What will the future threat landscape look like? And how do we build towards something like this? Most importantly, how do we deploy AI responsibly for something like this? So I'm just going to tell you a little bit about the context for the study, why this was commissioned, why this is interesting. And then I'll tell you about the study aims, the method that we used, and then what we found. And then if there's some time, I'll tell you about the recommendations. But the full report is available online at cetas.turing.ac.uk. So just to start, the reason for this study was, increasing concern about increasing automation of cyber attacks, and most importantly, what that could mean once it gets to a point where it exceeds human capacity to respond to those cyber attacks. We're also concerned about things like the lowering barriers of entry for threat actors, given the proliferation of open source tools. Open source cyber gyms, for example, to build some of these agents, and also the speed and scale of attacks. We keep hearing this over and over again whenever we talk to practitioners. It's overwhelming, and some have even described it to us as almost a physical sport. It's extremely draining to be working in cyber defense these days. There's also uneven capability for cyber defense across society. So I'm less worried about big tech firms, but when you think about SMEs and mid-tiers, promising companies that have innovation potential and lots of potential to contribute towards prosperity in the UK, how do we close some of those gaps? What do we do about disadvantaged groups? I think cyber skills shortages is also a very well-documented policy challenge. And most of all, we're also interested in how the threat landscape is evolving. So besides the speed and scale, we're also interested in this idea of stealthiness and deception. When we think back to the physical invasion of Ukraine, ahead of the actual physical invasion, we saw wiper malware shutting down networks all across Ukraine. But although that was spotted and addressed relatively quickly, or so it was claimed, we do know that about a month into the physical invasion, we were still seeing networks shut down all across the country. So was it really fast enough? And also, are they getting smarter? Are there ways that those agents are potentially hampering some of our critical functions in ways that we don't yet know about? IARPA, for example, it shouldn't be DARPA, is doing some really interesting work on Trojan AI, which I would encourage you all to look into. And then there's also been a lot of interest in AI. In 2016, we saw human masters get beaten by AI. It's also been replicated in other places like chess, Dota 2. There's some interesting work in DeepMind on AI and diplomacy as well. And we're seeing a lot more literature on AI for cybersecurity as well. So in the period between 2000 to 2022, you can see there's been almost, there's been this huge curve with a lot of almost like only experimental research on AI for cybersecurity, but nothing that's really working towards a common overarching goal, or that's even defining what autonomous cyber defense is and what it should look like. So we were motivated by this. Also looking at the cage challenges, when you look at how the possible number of actions, 36, compared to the possible number of actions for Dota 2 looks like, it's clear that there should be more potential if we had bigger and more realistic simulations and testing ranges. So if we had a cyber gym as large as the one that Dota had, for example, what kind of results could we see? Like, where else could AI go when it comes to cybersecurity? So our research was led by 4 research questions. The first is, where are we at? What's the current state of the art in autonomous cyber defense? How do we disentangle fact from fiction? As John was saying, there's so much hype at the moment, but not all those tools are doing what they say on the tin. This is something that we keep hearing from our government partners over and over again, and it's quite a serious challenge. But also, what could a potential vision for autonomous cyber defense look like? We couldn't even find a concrete definition that encapsulates all of the experimental research that, in some places is duplicated, that don't build on top of each other. What could we offer as a possible concept for autonomous cyber defense? And then what are the technical and policy challenges for achieving those visions? Because it's not just important to kind of have a guiding concept, it's also important to know where your pain points are going to be and how you might be able to overcome those, and what actions can you take to accelerate progress. So to do that, we looked at the technical literature. We also did interviews with our government partners, lots and lots of technical experts. I don't have a technical background. My degree was in war studies. I specialize in futures research methods. So we spoke to a lot of technical experts all across the Five Eyes, European countries. We also spoke to some of the big tech firms. We spoke to some SMEs developing some promising technology in this area. We also spoke to behavioral scientists to understand what human-machine teaming should look like. And we talked to legal and ethics experts who specialize in AI. And then we wrote up the reports, and now we're at the kind of research dissemination stage. So onto the main findings, because I know this is what you really want to hear. So in terms of a common definition for autonomous cyber defense, our team across CSET and CTAS came up with the following definition. So autonomous cyber defense describes systems capable of protecting organizations and users through systems hardening, network and endpoint management, threat detection and intrusion response and recovery without direct human tasking. They independently compose and implement safe, proportionate, and effective courses of action to accomplish goals based on observation, knowledge, and understanding of the world. So the main distinction here, really, compared to a lot of the more sort of like automated solutions that we're seeing in the market, is this emphasis not just on observing and quickly identifying threats, but also of taking action and recovering faster. So these are some snippets from some of the interviews. I won't go through them in detail since I'm conscious of time, but just to give you a flavor of what our interviewees were saying, we spoke to a lot of practitioners, and they were saying, it'd be great if we had a system that could, for example, autonomously revert to a known good state, or that could patch code without breaking functionality. This is still something that's very common. This is a very nascent technology area, so I don't want to give the impression that we're going to have autonomous cyber defense next year. There's a long way to go and a lot of technical challenges that need to be overcome. And rather than a human operator, a human master, overseeing individual decisions by the autonomous agent, since remember we're talking about speed and scale that could exceed human capacity, you might think of the human operator as more of like a choreographer. So maybe if they're choreographing a ballet, they could manage the system in more declarative terms like maximum congestion here, disable this, find all this, and do this. Trust came up over and over again. The more we did this study, the more I realized that actually everyone was talking about only a partially autonomous system. So we were still really talking about human-machine teaming rather than a completely autonomous cyber defense system. In about 3 to 5 years, so we asked everyone to tell us what it might look like in 3 to 5 years versus, like 10, 20 years. And in the 3 to 5 year horizon, the key challenge is to start to test these systems on a more representative environment. So, maybe if we could go beyond the really small training environments that academics are using now to something that maybe is scaled up to a small SMEs network, for example, then that would be very useful. And something that also came up really strongly in the findings was that we may want to hold back with this 5% that's really risky and that you may wish to be non-negotiable for humans to control. So there needs to be human overwatch on any type of partially autonomous cyber defense system. Maybe in the beginning, there'd be kind of more close overwatch, and then over time, maybe you could move towards something like random sampling to ensure that the system is still working as planned. It hasn't drifted from the original concept. So we also asked our interviewees, what kind of defensive countermeasures would you expect the system to be able to do? And besides identifying and detecting threats, they emphasize the importance of also being able to protect, respond, and recover, but also to be able to do things like employ decoys, canaries, and honey nets. So we may not want to immediately expel a red team agent that's entered the system. You may want to be able to observe, learn from it, and reverse engineer, for example, how it had come to how it works and how you might be able to better protect your system against something like that. We also emphasize the need to stay within the operational boundary of your own network. So there is a cultural distinction here between the UK and the US. So between our UK and US government respondents, we definitely saw more of a forward threat hunting discourse in their responses compared to here in the UK and the tolerance level here. Whereas there were some interviewees who were talking about systems that could also not just defend, but also hack back, find the original source and hack back. And in terms of the degree of autonomy, like I said, the emphasis was very much on partial autonomy, but they emphasized things like, you need something that's capable of being able to execute successful high-stakes decisions, mission completion, without, a human having to be in the loop in every single decision that every single agent in the system does. And it should be able to adapt to previously unseen operational and environmental conditions. But how you get to the trust to actually deploy something that's using RL, that is still an open question, and it's one of the policy challenges that we explore as well. In terms of the work share and what the human versus the autonomous agent's duties are, we envisage that humans will be removed from detailed tasking, and they're more like the people are involved in designing, building, testing the system, coaching it, maintaining it, ensuring that it's still working as planned. And they might also be, coaching or auditing the system. Maybe similarly to when you have a new person join your team in the beginning, you might have a tighter leash, and then over time, as the system becomes more reliable, that might change as well. Now, we found innumerable technical challenges. to developing autonomous cyber defense. And CSET Georgetown led on the analysis on this, so if there are any technical questions that I can't answer, I'm more than happy to put everyone in touch with my co-authors. But I'll try to do them justice. So some of the technical challenges that we found, and we don't expect that this will be comprehensive because, again, the technology is so nascent that as the fundamental research accelerates, we can expect to also identify more technical challenges and more precise ones as well. But first, you need bigger and better training environments. They have to be complex enough to be useful, but to have a small enough number of actions and observations to be manageable. And also you need to think about your neural networks. So you need neuro-adapted neural networks, not just to retain learned strategies in previous games, but to learn the strategy in the current game that it's in. We're not sure how to do that yet. And then obviously, you know, everyone knows this, there are lots of high computational requirements and costs. And then there are also issues around finding the right pitch to define the rewards for RL, because if they're too narrow, then, you know, it might be too constricting. But if they're too broad, then it might start behaving in unexpected ways that you wouldn't want on something that's defending your network. And we're also not sure if it's even possible to build defensive agents without building their offensive counterparts to plan against that. This is the part of the research that's still very hazy. We don't have a whole lot of certainty about how exactly cyber threats or autonomous agents on the red team are going to develop in the future. But how do we ensure that autonomous agents are more beneficial to defense rather than offense? And then we need to think about securing not just the autonomous agent, but the research that underpins this. They could be manipulated through data poisoning, for example, or stolen for reverse engineering. Then transferability from the training environment to a real-world scenario is still also a really big challenge. In terms of the policy challenges, the one challenge that kept being repeated over and over again was how human-machine teaming is going to look like for a partially autonomous cyber defense system. What are the appropriate levels from a scale of 0, 1, 2, 3, 4? And exactly what are the actions that the autonomous agent does in contrast to the human operator? What are the error risks for that level of autonomy? And what should the authorized bounds be? This is actually the main focus of phase 2 of this research, which is still ongoing. So I don't have any findings to report yet. But that should be out sometime next year. So if this is of interest, then do keep in touch, find me in the break, and I'll make sure that you have a copy of the report once it's out. The second most commonly reported policy challenge was how testing and evaluation is going to look like for autonomous cyber defense. We need the system to be adaptable because threats are always changing. It needs to be observable. The human operator needs to have situational awareness of what's happening on the network, even though they're not involved in the direct tasking. And some of the decisions will need to be offloaded to the autonomous agent. System needs to be secure, it needs to be transferable, it needs to be directable, as in, you need to be able to intervene if the autonomous agents behave in illogical ways. And it needs to be auditable. If something goes wrong, and you need to think about things like liability, then you need some way to log exactly what's happening on the network and what actions were taken against whatever actions. And this goes beyond explainability, which is the main focus of a lot of the academic literature at the moment. So this is something that I really want to emphasize. We also found challenges around developing the skills base. There are no cyber AI experts at the moment. I wouldn't even count myself as one. But there isn't a lot of research on this. You either have cybersecurity experts or AI experts, but to even build the system, we need to start developing the skills base. We need to encourage people to pursue these careers. And then academics also need the strategic horizon funding for this. So when you saw the possible number of actions for Dota compared to the cage challenges, it's clear that we need to be scaling up a lot more to make this a reality, and that means funding that's not just like for 2 years to build your team and then that's it, but something that's sustained and that's working towards a long-term effort to match your ambition. And then we need to think about the tricky, sticky bits about liability and criminal responsibility whenever something goes wrong, which could range from economic losses to loss of life. And then there are issues around supply chain security, so not just theft of the whole system wholesale, but along your supply chain. How are you going to ensure that it doesn't get manipulated or tampered with on the way? And then finally, there was also a policy challenge that kept coming up over and over again about how you distribute autonomous cyber defense across society. Like, how do you distribute it to smaller companies or disadvantaged groups? And even on a global scale, how do we bring this to developing countries, for example, who might not have the capital to do the R&D for autonomous cyber defense? But, why does this matter for the UK? Because their companies might be integrated along the UK supply chains, and their vulnerabilities are still vulnerabilities for UK national security. I'll skip the recommendations because we've run out of time, but these are all available on our website, which is ctas.turing.ac.uk. And my email is also on the screen if you have any follow-up questions or if you want to get in touch about phase 2. I'm in particular hoping to reach out to more CISOs and SOC analysts to get their perspective about authorized bounds for autonomous cyber defense and what the permissible actions should or should not be. I think it's so important to be able to speak to practitioners, and it's always really hard to find the right people within industry just from kind of looking at open sources. So if anyone at this conference is interested in helping to support our research, please do keep in touch, because I think the findings are only as good as the data that we're able to collect. So yeah, it would be much appreciated. Thank you.